Let's jump right into this explainer and unpack the friction that is currently sparking some incredibly intense debate across Australia's public square. We're looking at a really fascinating intersection right now, one where media, taxpayer funding, and shifting political dynamics are all colliding and making waves. It's kind of a complex web of reactions, but we are going to break the whole shebang down step by step so you can see exactly where the flashpoints are.
Now, what's wild about this stark criticism regarding a controversial new hire is that it's actually coming from inside the broadcaster itself. When a host from the network's very own roster, Charlie Pickering from The Weekly, steps up to say a programming move is problematic, well, you know you've got a major cultural and organizational debate on your hands. It isn't just outside noise. We're talking about a real internal rift.
To make sense of these fast-moving conversations, we're going to map out the arguments across four main areas. First, a controversial podcast choice. Second, debating public broadcaster funding. Third, shifting political polls. And finally, the executive experience debate.
Okay, starting with part one, a controversial podcast choice. The ABC's new hire sparks debate.
So the ABC recently announced they hired Grace Tame, former Australian of the Year and a very well-known activist, to host a brand new 4-part podcast series. The program is titled Autistic AF, and it's basically designed to feature Tame speaking openly about being neurodivergent. However, the second her appointment was announced, it generated this immediate, intense pushback from various public figures.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how broad that reaction was. We've got concerns being raised by a really wide variety of community leaders. You have Robert Gregory from the Australian Jewish Association, Alex Rivechin pointing out the risks of rewarding controversial comments, and as we saw just a minute ago, even fellow ABC personnel like Charlie Pickering publicly voicing their discomfort. So this isn't just one unified political bloc complaining, it's a remarkably diverse array of voices.
So, why the outrage, right? Well, the controversy largely stems from Tame's recent public commentary. Shortly after the tragic Bondi attack, Tame publicly called to globalize the intifada. Critics like Robert Gregory found this deeply inappropriate and honestly shocking. He expressed utter disbelief that the public broadcaster would hire someone making those kinds of statements and flat out labeled the decision as entirely tone-deaf.
Which brings us to part two, debating public broadcaster funding. Taxpayer funding versus user pays models.
Basically, we are seeing two totally different funding philosophies clashing right now. On one side, we have the current ABC model. This relies on broad subsidization by Australian taxpayers, completely regardless of whether those taxpayers actually agree with the content being produced. On the other side, we've got a counter-proposal championed by One Nation MP Barnaby Joyce. He's arguing for a subscription-based model, similar to other streaming networks, where audiences pay directly and exclusively for the content they actually want to support.
And Barnaby Joyce definitely did not mince words when discussing this. He straight up called the situation a disgrace. His argument is that if the broadcaster wants to platform what he views as extreme inner-city left-wing ideas, and he specifically points to the hiring of Grace Tame as an example of this, well, then they should transition to a subscription model. He claims this current direction causes absolute friction because taxpayers really shouldn't be forced to subsidize views they fundamentally oppose. Essentially, he's saying the ABC should test its popularity in a user-pays market.
All right, moving into part three, shifting political polls, the momentum of One Nation.
Now, this debate isn't just happening in TV studios or on social media, it's actually showing up in the polls. Recent data reveals a very clear, corroborated trend across multiple surveys. The Sky News Pulse poll recently showed One Nation gaining significant ground, literally pulling above Labour. And what makes this so compelling is that it's not just some isolated glitch in the data. The Redbridge poll from that very same week mirrored this exact momentum, confirming the trend.
Responding to these numbers, Joyce acknowledges the polling as a great honor and, obviously, a clear indicator of public sentiment. But interestingly, he also issues a word of caution to his own side. He emphasizes that the party absolutely cannot fall into the trap of hubris. As he points out, while the corroborated polls show momentum, the ultimate test is actually ground-truthing it at the ballot box. They still have to go out and prove themselves to the voters.
And that leads us right into part four, the executive experience debate. Paul Kelly versus Barnaby Joyce. Prominent journalist Paul Kelly from The Australian wrote a scathing piece recently, directly challenging One Nation's leadership potential. He stated quite bluntly that Pauline Hanson and her party have built nothing structurally and show absolutely zero capacity to exercise executive power. In his view, she's a known commodity who is simply not fit in any sense to be the Prime Minister of the country.
Now, this severe critique forces us to ask a really fascinating question about the fundamental prerequisites for the highest office in the land. Is it an absolute requirement for a leader to have a resume just packed with major organizational management before taking on the role of prime minister?
Joyce strongly countered Kelly's assessment by basically just pointing at history. He listed several recent prime ministers. We're talking Anthony Albanese, Scott Morrison, Tony Abbott, and John Howard, arguing that literally none of them had managed a major organization prior to taking the top job. According to Joyce, leaders don't just arrive fully formed with pristine corporate credentials. Rather, they grow into the role once they're actually in it.
So let's look at how these two very contrasting views on leadership stack up. On one side, Paul Kelly asserts that a leader absolutely requires a proven, tangible track record of building capacity. On the other side, Barnaby Joyce is proposing a totally different framework. He argues that the fundamental building block of a leader is actually being a philosophical rock in a time of vagaries, someone who doesn't just chase the latest polls, coupled with the humility to take counsel from a highly informed team.
To back up this whole team-oriented philosophy, Joyce emphasized that any prime minister has to acknowledge they aren't the font of all wisdom. He pointed out that one nation is already bringing in heavy-hitting corporate experience to advise their ranks. He specifically name-dropped David Farley, the former head of the Australian Agricultural Company, which, by the way, is a massive enterprise with operations reaching all the way into the U.S. Joyce uses this as a prime example of the kind of executive experience they are currently utilizing behind the scenes.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this defining question to ponder. We've seen how a single podcast hire can expose some incredibly deep fault lines over taxpayer funding, and how shifting polls bring intense magnifying glass scrutiny onto the qualifications of alternative political leaders. So ask yourself, in today's highly polarized landscape, what truly drives the modern vote? Is it a pristine resume of executive management experience, or is it an unwavering philosophical consistency? It's a question that will absolutely shape the upcoming elections. Thanks for walking through this with me.